All right, hello everyone. This is Tom, Professor Barry here. We are moving into race stratification, race and ethnicity. Yeah, so like we've laid a lot of groundwork. We've covered a lot of ground in this class. Theories, perspectives, a lot of different ideas. We're going to use some of those and bring them forward into our discussion about race stratification. Next week is on gender stratification, and then we get into a lot of different smaller topic areas. If you're interested in like exploring in more detail and further race, class, gender, we have a class, Soc 212, Sociology of Race, Class, and Gender. I think it's a really informative class. It's valuable, beneficial, helps us shed light, understanding the past, present, how we sort of just how to approach thinking about these complexities and challenges with inequities and privilege and domination going on with race, class, and or gender. All right, so let's let's just start thinking about the sort of idea, the slide here, this idea that race is real, but it's not biologically real. There is no biological basis for race. And we're going to kind of talk about that, the history and the origins of biological race, and then how to compare that with social construction of race. Race as we know it, there's no biological basis for it. At the same time, race is powerful because we define it that way. And then structures and institutions are structured around that lens of race. So it's like this weird space to recognize, one, that race is not, there is no biological basis for it, but it's real because we've categorized it that way historically, still do today. And it's important because people's identities and experiences, there's racial differences in terms of people's experiences and how people are treated by institutions and others. So we have to recognize that race is real, but it's not real in a biological sense. So you can kind of even this first slide, biological ideas of race, we can look at that today and say, there's scientific racism going on in this space. There's white supremacy operating in this space. What is this about? These biological conceptions of race. It would shock us today of looking at this and go, man, it's clear that there's racism that's so evident. And yet at that time period in the 1800s, when scientists were first starting to identify these ideas of biological conceptions of race, they believed that they were accurately, objectively measuring and identifying distinctions between races. So these racial categories that early scientists in the 1800s were developing, they believed that they were being objective. They were producing quality work and sound science. And they were trying to justify or trying to explain with that lens of science, being able to categorize and see differences between human populations and try to come up with some way of understanding that. And this biological conception of race kind of comes out of that. So it's important to think about biological ideas of race don't exist before the Enlightenment and scientific ways of knowing. I mean, you can go back for sure, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, go back to ancient societies in the East. There was definitely distinctions made between different groups. Oftentimes it was around language or cultural differences, but it wasn't like there was a biological idea of race. Like that is very distinct. That's a byproduct of the development of science and the development of the Enlightenment. Once we start, ancient Egypt, Rome, no. I mean, people saw difference, people recognized difference, but again, it's like around ethnic group lines, religion, language, culture, but not this idea of biological race. What gets kind of interesting to consider or to understand is like when biological ideas of race are developing, at the same time, there's what's going on is colonization, exploration, the Western, from Western nations encountering people from different lands and places, colonization, domination of different lands and different people. Like this kind of stuff is going on at the same time. So it's really interesting that the science is providing this explanation of biological ideas of race at the same time where Western nations are conquering and dominating other people in other lands. So in some ways, and then the slave trade and other aspects that we can kind of link into and say, okay, biological ideas of race help to justify the inequities that are going on within the world around us. So they become a powerful ideology to explain and provide an out for exploitation of other people. You can kind of read it here in like this little kind of excerpt from a book back in the 1800s, these different types of people that are being identified, these different categories. Even the language, I mean, they'd be shocking to us today. Like, what are these categories about? So it's the idea from biological ideas of race that we're categorizing these races. People are trying to systematically measure these differences and then categorize them. Early racial scientists identified, I don't know, sometimes 3, 4, or 5 different racial categories. These would be categories that would have been used back in the 1800s. I mean, like, again, it's sort of this obvious, from today's standpoint, obvious racism that's in these depictions that are there. And these are historically like important to recognize that this is a project that's facilitating racism within society itself. Scientists may have believed that they were being objective. This is the idea of the mismeasure of man by Stephen Jay Gould, where he walks through the ways in which scientists were measuring humans, both in terms of race and gender and class, and that scientists believed that they were being objective, that they're objectively measuring, but they were providing an explanation that was very ideological. There was a belief in about these differences that helped provide some justification, or just provide justification for the domination of other groups. So Linnaeus is the first he's the first scientist to come along who creates this sort of taking that from the natural world space, think about biology and botany, applying those same principles, but applying them to human communities. So overlaying, look at the human population at large, and then dividing, categorizing based on these different characteristics. This is a depiction of the Black Irish. The reason I include this is to recognize that, man, it's pretty arbitrary that these categories of race are not only being developed, but we see the categories we don't even understand today. Things like, well, this depiction of the Black Irish, like, where does that even kind of come from? And we think about biological conceptions of race, when we compare it to social construction. The social construction question is, where do these categories come from? Why did they emerge? And what's their implication? Part of it that's still around today, the scientific racism, say, well, those are things of the past. I think that blatant form of scientific racism is predominantly a relic of the past, but scientific racism is still part of culture and society. 1980s, a book called The Bell Curve stirred a lot of debate, pushback about a conversation where these two different academics were arguing that the reason for the certain outcomes like crime rates and poverty rates and occupational status and wealth status and income status, that part of the reason for these differences between whites and people of color has to do with biological factors, that it has to do with aptitudes and IQ and intelligence that's biologically rooted. This is 1980s, and a lot of individuals in the social science field push back against that and critique that idea. This is sort of a return of ideas of scientific racism, a belief, this like social Darwinism, a belief in the evolutionary perspective, and that there's a certain groups in society that are better than others, and that there's a biological basis for that. So social construction of race takes us to a different place. We think about, to go back to our definition of social construct, these are human creations. Categories of race are human creations. It's not biologically determined. We start to view the world through these constructs. These constructs do become important because we view the world through them. We see the world through them. We see ourselves sometimes through them. So they have real powerful implications. So it's arbitrary, the meaning that we give things. So racial categories are arbitrary. They fluctuate based on culture and time, but they're really real. Because within a culture, if you define it that way, people respond as if it were true that way. So they get institutionalized, they get viewed as being reality. When we're looking at social constructs, we're oftentimes paying attention to language. What is the language of those categories? And the language of those categories reveal a lot about culture and time and place. So think about like the language of a racial category of, think categories to describe, we use people of color today, like that language of people of color, communities of color, students of color, relatively new concept to have that language part of our vocabulary. That change in language is reflecting probably a greater sensitivity and a greater awareness of the unique experiences of individuals who are not a member of the dominant group. So language is important to understand if we're looking at social construction of race. Like I said before, I can't share these videos. I don't know if I should get to a hyperlink. Anyway, there's a lot of videos out there if you just kind of look for like social construction of race or biological race, take you to different places. What I'm trying to indicate here in this one is like the US Census, these are all categories. The question is like, where do these categories come from? Why does the census use these categories, and how has the census changed the categories it's used over a period of time? So these categories have not been uniform, throughout the years. The number of categories, the language of the categories, they change across time and place. So it's kind of like a slide to kind of indicate that the racial categories in the census reflect the social definition of race. So now the census recognizes when they're cataloging and asking individuals to identify their race, they're recognizing these races are the races that are on the census are not biological races. They're not rooted in genetics. These are social definitions of race. So it's important that we kind of like look at, I think, being able to, for when somebody's filling out the census, that they identify that the race they identify with, so that we can understand if there's, for example, like what is the income level? What is the wealth level of individuals? What schools, the different data that's collected by the census, educational level, these kind of things that if we're cataloging and being able to people identify what the race they identify with, and we're looking at these outcomes, we can better understand how race may impact a person's life. So by not including information about race, it's going to be hard to tell if there's discrimination and inequities going on within society itself. So it's important to gather information based on race, but also to recognize that race is not biological. So another way to kind of get this sort of idea that the faultiness of biological ideas of race and think about race as a social construct, this work of Isabel Wilkerson, it's a really, I think there's some podcast interviews with her if you're interested, just kind of exploring, sort of America as a caste system. And it's deeply rooted in America's history. And part of its class, part of its race, it's that intersectional nature. And then one thing to kind of, I put here is like after a talk she gave one time, somebody came up to her and said, there are no Black people in Africa, and that they become Black when they immigrate to America. Like, so that category of Black is not a language that would be used in Africa. So that kind of illustrates or gives you an anchor to think about, oh, okay, that's what we're talking about, that race is not biological. Race is a social construct. Just think about how different cultures define different groups of people. And so categories change based on time period and culture and all those different kind of things. The history, if you're interested in this, historian Nell Irving Painter, the history of white people, just the racial science. I got to figure out how to get rid of those things. Racial science. That's a book that, I don't know, a lot of good historical documentation walking through the history and development of ideas about race. And then Hanny Lopez book, White by Law, like institutional level, how the legal system supported certain definitions of race over periods of time, so historical. Another example of social construction of race, different cultures define race in different ways. Brazil, much more elaborate in terms of a system of categorizing and thinking about race. 136 variations of Brazilian skin colors, so these different categories. They call it like the color, like a color gradient. For the United States, we had historically a one-drop rule. It's called a one-drop rule for African Americans. For Blacks, I mean, one drop of African descent would put someone in a category of being Black, where in other countries, it's just not the case. That's different history, different culture, different space. So while ideas of race are created by humans, arbitrary and flexible, doesn't mean it doesn't exist in our perceptions, our attitudes, behaviors, or the way that institutions operate. While we're all part of this human community, different groups are labeled in different ways, viewed differently. And those are particular to time, location, and space. So it's a social process that's embedded in culture. It's not biological, race is not biologically rooted. It's not an objective fact. There's racism that's built in this sort of idea of biological race. Another example of that, of thinking about, sometimes there's conversations about Asians as the model minority, looking at the overall educational achievement, wealth, income status of Asian Americans tend to outpace whites. And so some individuals talk about Asian Americans as being the model minority. There's a lot of problems with this viewpoint. One, it's like the question of, okay, it erases from our view the complexities of the Asian American community. So while maybe the case that Asian Americans outperform whites in educational level and wealth and income as a collective, there's a lot of variability in that collective. So for look here, all these different groups that are identified that would be under that Asian American category have varied experiences. And so by saying Asian Americans is the model minority, it's erasing all the variability in terms of these outcomes. Another challenge or problem with the Asian as minority myth, Asian as a model minority idea, is that sometimes it's used to say Asian Americans have become successful. Other groups that don't become successful, it must be a fault of that group for themselves. So there's a reason why it becomes an ideology to be able to put forward an idea or accept an idea that other groups who are not as successful, it's because of their own failure, kind of blaming a group versus thinking about this idea, the model minority, maybe it's used as a tool or it helps support an idea about the lack of success of other groups. So let's look at kind of the implications of these biological or essentialist ideas about race. This was going to be it's a video about eugenics, the time period. So eugenics meaning good, and genes, genetics, genes. So think about time period in the 1800s, 1900s, all the way to the 1970s in the United States, where a belief among some, and this would be the scientific racism, that you can create a stronger society by controlling the gene pool within society itself. The War Against the Weak is a really powerful book, Edwin Black exploring the history of eugenics, the eugenics movement in the United States, as well as over in Europe. Cold Spring Harbor in New Jersey, was a center that was advocating for and advancing in the ideas of race science in the 1800s and 1900s. And it led to a lot of significant dehumanization of individuals, stripping individuals of rights, implications for these ideas in terms of access to resources, social control, coercion, involuntary sterilization, incarceration. I mean, all these different factors that go on by a belief in biological ideas of race, a belief in the promotion of a better society through race betterment, through promoting the good genes, the dominant genes. I mean, it led to all these kind of really powerful outcomes, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well that accepted these ideas. This is Australia, a film called Rabbit Proof Fence, kind of like the Aboriginal community members being put into boarding schools, the belief that after 3 generations that they could remove the indigenous component of an individual, and a person could become a member of the dominant group, this like breeding kind of idea. I mean, this is all faulty, but it's important to recognize, historically what was going on so we can be aware of the power of that history, even how it's reverberated today, and also be mindful of the ways in which ideas of race get constructed. The more we're aware, the more we can be in a better position to kind of evaluate and think more completely through ideas about race. So an idea of miscegenation and the mixing of races. So in the United States, there was this thing called the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, laws preventing individuals of different races from marrying one another, specifically white and black, in the United States. Concern about in the 1950s, concern about rock and roll, that rock and roll was promoting black and white youth from intermingling, from being together, and then promoting potentially sexual activity between blacks and whites. So it's like this idea of promoting predominantly for white parents to not buy and engage in rock and roll because it could be detrimental for their kids. I mean, this kind of space. It wasn't all the way until 1967 Supreme Court case of Loving versus Virginia, and that court case deemed it unconstitutional to prevent two different races, individuals who identify two different races, from marrying each other. So in 1967, it was the first court case that said states cannot ban members of different racial groups from marrying. So bans on interracial marriage were banned, all the way until 1967. I want to bypass, I guess I can talk about this just real briefly. Well, now I want to bypass this. I'm going to go back. I'll just talk about it real quick. There was a belief in the 1950s for a period of time. If you kind of think about the 1950s, there was a migration of African Americans out of the South, civil rights movement going on in the 1950s, suburbia developing 1950s, desegregation, 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. So there's a lot of social change going on in that time period. There was a belief that individuals who had a drop of Black blood of African heritage could pass as white. And there was this concern about that for some in the United States in the 1950s. And there was a concern that people were passing as white, and how do you prepare, or how to ensure that the races were being kept separate. This is a film called Pinky in the 1950s. This is a mother and a daughter. And it's kind of, the reason I sort of bring this up is this sort of fear that's going on is a fear that's a socially constructed fear that's based on an idea of biological race, based on an idea of white supremacy and sort of a racial order that's there at that time. So the one-drop rule, very particular to the United States. Here's an example of the one-drop rule. This is 1980s, where Susie Gilroy Phipps applies she wants to travel abroad. She's trying to get her visa or her passport. And she needs her birth certificate. She sees on her birth certificate, it says colored on her birth certificate. So she never knew that. She doesn't identify. She identifies as white. She goes to the court to have her birth certificate changed to reflect what the race she identifies with. And she has 1/32nd in terms of African lineage, and she's classified as African-American or as Black. That is arbitrary. It's that one-drop rule, very particular to the United States. And it's understanding that history that becomes informative and important. There are these racial categories like the octoroon. They had all these different racial scientists had all these categories. If a person is half or mixed, they're mulatto. Quarter, an eighth is octoroon. 16th, 32nd, there's all these different racial categories to make these distinctions. So if you think about, that's kind of, just kind of working through race as biology or race as a social construct. Now we can kind of move into, okay, racism in society, think it at a structural level versus at an individual level. Start by thinking about or defining racism itself. So you can kind of read through this idea, belief that race accounts for human differences, that certain races are more superior than others. Sociology kind of makes it a little bit more complex, that racism is an ideology. It's a belief that gives different racial groups different status and supports that the status that is given to those groups are there for objective reasons. So though races are not inherently unequal, racism gives the idea or promotes the idea that differences in outcomes between racial groups that's a reflection of the difference in races themselves. So genetics and biology don't support the outcomes in terms of racial inequality. These are inequalities that are part of the social environment, cultural environment. They're a byproduct of an ideology of racism. Racism allows them to permits them to continue on, or to not challenge the inequities, to not challenge white supremacy, and its sort of places in society. Racism provides a belief to be able to support maintaining the system as it is. Prejudice is attitude and belief. Discrimination is behavior. So behavior, institutions can be discriminatory without the actors within those institutions being conscious of it, aware of it, or consciously promoting discrimination. So institutional level could be within the practices of an institution. It could be within the laws of an institution, the daily workings of an institution. There may be a policy within an institution that's discriminatory, and individuals may not even be aware of whether of the dominant group or the subordinate group may not even be aware of the discriminatory aspects of the law or the policy. So discrimination happens both at an individual level, but also important to think about it at an institutional level. I'll give you a couple of different examples in a minute. So racism is a belief and ideology to help support a system of inequality. Anti-racism is to be actively opposed to a system of racism and be working to change it. So it's the importance of that kind of language is members of the dominant group, let's just say, for example, so as a white in the United States, to be white, to be neutral is to actually be helping to support a system of racism. So when a person recognizes where privilege is happening or where inequities are happening, to be working to change those institutional practices, to bring those things up in conversation, that's more of anti-racism. So it's working to change the system of inequality, to encourage conversations around racism, to promote greater equity and greater equality. Like that's a move towards anti-racism. So to be neutral is actually to be supporting the system. Another thing to think about is like this idea that privilege and domination, so privilege advantage, unearned advantage, and domination, let's say discrimination, so inequalities that are structured, that are institutional, that those two things are actually connected. Privilege comes from individuals being dominated. So the privileges that individuals have within society, whether they're race, class, or gender, are coming about because somebody else has experienced a negative or experienced a loss, or it's coming off the backs of someone else. So it's important to kind of recognize that actually that privilege is there because there's domination going on somewhere else. So I'll give you an example of institutional discrimination in this book called The Color of the Law. There was a practice in the 1950s that I've called redlining, where there's like some mortgage companies, banks, and lenders would draw a line around certain areas of community and redline them, where they wouldn't provide loans within these communities. And so people couldn't secure a loan, or if they had a house in those communities, people wouldn't be able to resell their home because people wouldn't be able to buy it unless they paid cash. And redlining was done. Now it's unconstitutional because the recognition that these were practices that were built upon white supremacy and racism of drawing this sort of boundaries. And it leads to a lot of problems that we even still experience today in a lot of urban environments, where the concentration of social inequality, of class and race, economics, dividing communities, separating communities. Certain communities, planned communities like this community in the Kansas City area, where Blacks were not even allowed to purchase property in the area, forbidden. So there's like suburbia. Part of this discussion about suburbia in the United States is one of racial exclusion as well. And I think about the long-term impact of that is that most people generate wealth based on their home. So if people were being denied the ability to purchase a home, not being able to get a loan, They weren't able to participate, or not even be able to live in certain communities, weren't able to participate in the kind of that expansion of wealth in America through home ownership. It's a great video. You can type in PBS NewsHour, put in that title there, and you get this short little talk, a few-minute talk, just about what the building of highways during the 1950s with suburbia came the highway system. And highways were, like, where were these highways being built? Oftentimes through communities of color, communities that didn't have the political power to fight back. So lower socioeconomic status communities as well. And this had an implication in terms of how communities were organized. Maybe even, go back to our chapter on deviance and think about the ecological approach or social disorganization theory, that these super highways that are being built through these communities divided communities and had an economic impact. And that's one reason for rising crime in the 1960s in some of these communities. So I brought up before that privilege and domination are connected. We think about things at a structural level. So institutional inequality, I think, is an important thing to recognize. It's not just the individual, it's at a structural level. Ideologies that are, or beliefs that are there in society. Racism is a belief to justify inequalities. We got to also be mindful, I think, of intersectionality. So the intersection of race, class, gender, and other areas of difference. So not all individuals of color have the same experience. I mean, gender matters, race matters. Not every member of the dominant group has the same experience. Whiteness changes based on class, based on gender. So intersectionality is important to recognize. One way of thinking about privilege and domination, I mean, recently affirmative action has been challenged recently, and kind of reversed to the protections that were provided with affirmative action. And there's a lot of work done, like, there's a lot of, so affirmative action providing institutional support for helping to ensure that individuals from historically disadvantaged groups have a more equal opportunity for application and entering colleges and universities. Like, that's one application of affirmative action. And in recent years, like this past year, 2023, that this Supreme Court really took a lot of the support out of affirmative action. This is very political. It's the question, is this really the change at the Supreme Court level is going to have an impact on the recruitment and applications and admissions of students of color into universities. So one thing you kind of can look at is say, okay, well, where's that coming from? Why, whether to support or not affirmative action? Are we trying to create an even playing field? We have this sort of idea, well, it's like, well, people shouldn't be given an advantage for application just because they're a member of a racial minority community. It's like, hey, I can have that conversation, but then I'd flip it around and say, what about the system of privilege that operates within these institutions? That there's it's called legacy status. If you had a parent or a grandparent who went to university, that you get kind of a benefit when you apply for that university. Or if you come from a certain class, and a certain class, and class can intersect with race, so it's more wealthy communities tend to be more white, have access to a lot of resources. So when you apply for college, you have a lot of privilege in that system. So affirmative action has helped, the pulling the rug out a little bit from affirmative action, or decreasing its influence in recent years, I think adds to the privilege. It's providing less recognition for the way in which race operates and trying to create a more even playing field. And, we're having this conversation about affirmative action, but not about ways in which privilege operates. I don't know, you can sort of look at, a lot of different factors, look at who's applying for universities, elite universities, what's the admission rate, legacy status is important, it's powerful. So privilege is not being challenged, but that's becomes a sort of an issue. We can talk more easily, I think, sometimes about the experience of minority groups, but the experience of privilege is going to be a harder conversation, because sometimes it's less visible, and sometimes people that are in the privileged position don't want to recognize the privilege that they do have. I don't know, this is like back Louisiana. This is a voting registration to be able to vote. This was back before Voting Rights Act of the 1964, early 1960s, in the Voting Registration Act at the federal level to prevent things like this. So go back to Jim Crow South, when there was legal segregation going on in the United States, and there were these laws put into place and rules and regulations that reinforced or that prevented Blacks from voting, and also from some poor whites from voting as well. It's like these are institutionally discriminatory practices. All right, so let's talk about whiteness a little bit, and think about using some of our sociological language and tools to kind of to pursue and think about white privilege. So one thing to recognize is that identity is part of who we are. It's based on our experience in life, right? So if you're a member of the dominant group, I'm going to formulate an idea of racial identity in a different way than if you're a member of a group that's been historically disadvantaged, or a group that's not part of the dominant group in society. So in this case, like look at this research here that Blacks are more likely, Hispanics more likely, Asians more likely to sort of see race in a different way than individuals of white that identify as white. Well, it's because, right, if you're a member of the dominant group, it's harder to see and recognize where advantage is happening or where disadvantage is happening if you're not experiencing that. I think it's kind of interesting to sort of think about the difference between a minority group and a majority group, or it helps to kind of clarify why that might be going on as far as the recognition and an identity around race. If a member of a minority group is often marked as being distinct from the majority group. So marked in various different ways within society to be marked as being distinct. It's usually an ascribed status, like race is an ascribed status, right? So there's a hierarchy going on within that ascribed status within society as well. And if you're a member of the dominant group, the description is in your favor. Puts you in a better light. So, maybe not as aware of race, how it operates within daily life. Member of minority groups receive unequal treatment. I'd say that members of privileged group get unequal treatment too, but that treatment is of an advantage. And those advantages may be less likely to be visible. And oftentimes members of minority group don't have the political power and social economic power to change things. And there's a connection between the minority groups exist because there's a dominant group, so that privilege and domination, the two of them operating. So think about white privilege. White privilege is under an advantage. Like people don't do things to actually gain that privilege, but there's a privilege that's going on there within society. Important to recognize intersectionality too. Not all whites have the same privilege. Class matters. This word becomes tricky where a person let's say, who's struggling economically, and sometimes a conversation around white privilege, they may push back against that idea that they have privilege because it's hard to recognize the white privilege that's there when they're already economically struggling. And I think that's important to keep in mind, is that, these ideas of privilege and domination and racism are intersectional. Race and class both matter. Gender matters in that space as well. And to see that privilege is a way of maintaining a system of inequality. So it's a powerful tool or a powerful instrument that reinforces inequality itself. So the racial identity of members of the majority group forms a little bit differently than members of the minority group. Whites have everybody has a racial identity, although people of color, it's much more distinct. People of color are much more aware of race and how it operates in daily society. Members of dominant groups have an identity, members of subordinate groups as well. But the dominant groups, based on their lived experience and their status position, less visible, less likely to be aware. I think people, especially younger generation, much more aware today about white identity, whiteness, white privilege, white advantage, all those different kind of things. The conversation is definitely different today than it was before. Before, I mean, like, let's say 10, 20, 30 years ago. Colorblindness, let's talk about colorblindness. And this is kind of like one kind of aspect to think about how in today's world to be overtly racist is still there, but there's a lot of colorblind racism happening in society. The norms around communicating about ideas about race have changed and changed over the years. People are a little bit more guarded about communicating ideas that may be viewed as being racist. So kind of racism has gone underground in some areas for some people and maybe for some institutions. So colorblind racism, this is the work of Eduardo Bonilla Silva. It's not only his work, but his book, Racism Without Racists, is I think, racism light, he calls it, or racism with a smile. People don't want to believe that they have racist ideas that are built upon ideas that are fit into that racist space. People don't want to see it. People don't want to see it in society. Some people do not want to recognize where it exists in society. So to believe that the world is colorblind, that we should be colorblind, is actually supporting that system of inequality. So let's kind of talk about, like what are some examples of colorblindness? The idea of I don't see color, I only see people, is ignoring the reality and the experiences of people of color. So it may come from a place of like good intent or a desire to be treating everyone equally. But colorblindness actually, by ignoring the realities of different groups of people, it allows for basically ignoring those realities. And if we're ignoring the realities, then we're not understanding the experiences of both members of the dominant group as well as members of groups that are being disadvantaged or who have a different experience based on race. I don't see color, but people tell me I'm white. To me, this is like, exactly, right? This person has a white identity. If somebody is wearing this shirt, it's an identity around the desire not to be able to see and recognize how whiteness operates in society. That's part of a racial identity. More recently with Black Lives Matter, the sort of response that all lives matter, it's very much like a colorblind racism idea. This goes back, this is like 1980s, Proposition 54, California. This is political. There was an organization that comes out of a particular political space of trying to get on the ballot to that federal government or that state institutions, universities, hospitals, anything that goes at the state level contracts, that they would no longer gather information of like an applicant, their race, that everything should be colorblind. And the idea that what they promoted is that if we don't, by not gathering this information, by not asking people, we're helping to encourage more colorblindness in society itself, we're not reinforcing the idea that races, let me reword that. The belief is that for those who are supporting Proposition 54 is that there shouldn't gather any information on race, because by gathering that information, we're reinforcing that there's differences in race. The problem with that, if we're not gathering the information on race of applicants or people who are applicants for jobs or for school, we don't know if there's discrimination going on. So we need to gather that information. We won't go through all the theories. We won't go through all the theories of race, but one concept to bring up is scapegoating theory. This kind of fits into the conflict theory space. I'm not going to worry about this chart here that I'm covering up. But scapegoating, blaming the racial group for problems that are structurally rooted, where immigration is oftentimes historically, we can go back to the 1800s. This is the Black Irish in the 1800s, the Chinese, the idea that the Chinese were and the Black and that the Irish were devouring America. There was a know-nothing party that kind of emerges during the time period. There was a fear of Catholicism because there's a Protestant, America as a strong Protestant nation. The first federal law prohibiting the immigration of a particular racial group is the Chinese. After the Transcontinental Railroad is built, there becomes a Chinese Exclusion Act to exclude Chinese from immigrating to America because this idea. So scapegoating economic problems, social problems on the backs of racial groups, because those groups don't have as much power. It's like scapegoating. You can see it in terms of more contemporary policies, with President Trump wanting to build a wall and the rhetoric around that, the reason why, a lot of scapegoating in that space. Conflict theory can also think about white supremacy, the history and contemporary aspects of white supremacy. that these ideas, these racist ideas that are built into society, they help maintain an order of order inequality. There's competition for resources between different groups. And sometimes by dividing groups and separating groups versus looking at our common interest as a way to maintain inequality at large. So there's a lot in common for workers of color and workers of the dominant group, but by dividing them and separating them, it helps to facilitate intergroup conflict, which serves ruling class interest. And that competition is linked to the structure itself. So go back to like immigration, where and I go back to social, remember our class and stratification, social stratification, structural social mobility, 1970s, 1980s, manufacturing jobs declining in the United States, white working class communities impacted by that. Immigration now becomes, immigrants from Central America and South America now can become a scapegoat, where the economic hardships in those communities, now politicians can blame, it's the immigration, it's the problem that are taking your jobs. And it's like, okay, that's a clever way and a convenient way to divide groups of people versus looking at their collective interest. Interactionism would get us in thinking about racial identity. White Fragility is a pretty powerful book by D'Angelo. Her examination of why it is difficult for some whites to engage in conversations around race, where they become sort of defensive and reactionary to conversations about that. Part of that's a racial identity difference. So thinking about interactionism, it's the meaning that we attach to race, our identities around race. This is a depiction of years ago, I went to Stone Mountain, Georgia, outside of Atlanta. This is a monument to the Confederacy. I can't pull that image up. It's General Lee Stonewall Jackson. I can't remember who the third person, this commemoration to the Confederacy. This particular monument was built during the 1950s, during the time period of desegregation, Brown versus Board of Education, civil rights movements. A lot of these monuments that were built during that, a lot of monuments about the Confederacy were built during the 1950s. At least that was one wave of Confederate monument building. So like that time period becomes really important when these monuments were built, when there was a move for greater equality. And then finally, think about critical race theory. I wanted to sort of mention this because of recent controversies. Critical race theory is just examining the way in which white supremacy and which race kind of works through our institutions. It comes out of the field of law and students going through law school. It's critical race theory. The evidence is not being taught in our K through 12 schools. Sure, right? Talking about the history of race in the United States, absolutely. There's a project the New York Times promoted called the 1619 Project of looking at the history of racism in the United States. And there's a kind of this pushback against that for some, pushing back against the teaching of history of race and race relations in the United States. It's like, wow, it's really powerful, the way in which critical race theory was used by some politicians to promote this kind of fear and concern of what's going on within our schools when there's no objective reality that critical race theory is being taught. It's a constructed fear that's going on that politicians are engaging in for some benefit, right? Benefit of votes, getting people emotionally invested in a particular idea, and it becomes really powerful. And you can look at different things, these, members of certain communities showing up at school board meetings and real hostile towards the school board members about what's going on in the classrooms. This is not based on objective data and information. It's based on a lot of fear and concern that parents, these individual parents or community members have. And I couldn't help but think in watching like some of these videos of, school board meetings and things like that, these concerned parents, there's a lot of white privilege in that space. If there was an issue that came up for members of, community of color, members of the community of color, to be there and represent that issue and to be speaking in the same tone, in the same way, and the same force at a school board meeting, I would imagine there's going to be a different reaction going on in that space. So it's kind of interesting to me, like even like this opposition to critical race theory individuals are showing up at these meetings, they have a lot of white privilege in that space, even to be able to do and communicate the ways they did in those particular meetings. Okay, it's a lot of information that we covered. Just got one more week of some serious content, and then we kind of move into all these different subject areas. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great week, and if you have any questions, let me know.